In 1905, more than 90% of every glass bottle made in the United States came from a single machine, built by a single man in Toledo, Ohio. Not most bottles, not a majority of bottles, 9 in 10. The machine ran at 4 bottles per second, no human breath, no child's hands. Before it existed, a grown man could blow 8 bottles in a working hour. After it existed, the same hour produced more than 14,000. 12 years earlier, 2 million people had walked through a glass palace on the Chicago Midway to watch Toledo's glassworkers spin silk from molten sand. The city was, by any measure, the glass capital of the world, and then across roughly 30 years, the companies dissolved, sold themselves to foreign buyers, fled to the suburbs, declared bankruptcy, and left. On August 2, 2014, the lake outside Toledo turned toxic, and nearly 500,000 people could not drink the water. This is the story of how a city built an industry that changed every shelf in America, and what happened when the industry decided it no longer needed the city. Chapter 1. The Harbor. The Maumee River runs northwest for 137 miles before it reaches the western corner of Lake Erie, depositing whatever it carries into the widest, shallowest, warmest of the Great Lakes. The river's mouth opens into Maumee Bay. Not a dramatic harbor, not a deep-water port of the kind that inspires mythology, but a functional one, and in 1833 function was everything. The surveyors who platted Toledo onto that low ground were not romantic men. They were measuring an advantage. Geography here is not scenery. The western end of Lake Erie is the hinge point between the settled east and the unfilled interior. The last place where a boat from Buffalo, from Detroit, from the whole long chain of the upper lakes, can offload its cargo before the continent shifts from water to land. Everything west of Toledo in the 1830s is either prairie or possibility. Toledo is where you stop before you push into either. It is a threshold, and thresholds, when enough people must cross them, tend to become cities. The location was valuable enough, it turned out, to start a war. In 1835, Ohio and the Michigan Territory both claimed the same 5-mile band of land running east to west across the southern tip of the lake, the Toledo Strip, which contained the Maumee's mouth and with it the entire logic of the harbor. Ohio had been a state since 1803. Michigan wanted statehood and needed the Strip to get it. Militias formed on both sides of the line. The governors of each exchanged letters of escalating grievance. Ohio's Governor Robert Lucas called up the state militia in the spring of 1835 and marched it north. Michigan's 19-year-old acting governor, Stevens T. Mason, answered in kind. And then almost nothing happened. A few men were arrested crossing the wrong boundary. A single member of the Ohio militia was stabbed with a penknife by accident and survived. A pig was killed, though the historical record is unclear on the circumstances. The Toledo War, as it was recorded and then half forgotten, was less a conflict than a negotiation conducted in the language of bluster. Congress resolved it in January 1837 by awarding Ohio the Toledo Strip and compensating Michigan with the western Upper Peninsula, a vast, cold, largely unmapped wilderness of copper and iron ore and timber that no one in Washington fully understood at the time. Michigan would spend the better part of a century arriving at the conclusion that it had gotten the better deal. Ohio kept the harbor. What the harbor built in the decades that followed was not a manufacturing city, but a moving city. The Miami and Erie Canal, completed to Toledo in 1845, connected Lake Erie to the Ohio River, linked, in other words, the Great Lakes system to the Mississippi Valley, which is to say nearly everything to nearly everything else. The railroads arrived next, and then more railroads, the Toledo and Ohio Central, the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Wabash. Grain came down from the north, coal came up from the south, lumber passed through from the forests of Michigan, Iron ore moved east from the ranges above Lake Superior, bound for the furnaces of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Toledo grew on the traffic of other people's goods, a city that handled wealth on its way somewhere else, that took its percentage from the passing freight and called that a living. The lake made this possible. Lake Erie supplied the harbor, the shipping lanes, the water, and, in the shallow glacial plains that ringed its western shore, something else, something that lay beneath the sand and the clay and the low fields, unremarked and unextracted, waiting with the patience of geology. Toledo at mid-century was prosperous and unremarkable, a junction that had not yet found its product. The thing that would find it was still underground. Chapter 2. The Accident of Fuel. The thing underground was not glass. It was what made glass possible. In the mid-1880s, prospectors drilling across northwest Ohio broke into something they had not expected. Beneath the flat glacial plain of the Trenton Formation lay one of the largest concentrations of natural gas ever found on the continent. The wells roared. The pressure was extraordinary. Whole towns lit their streets for free, and manufacturers who had spent decades calculating coal costs suddenly faced a fuel that cost almost nothing. Glass, which requires sustained heat above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit to melt silica into a workable state, is among the most fuel-hungry industries in the world. The men who ran Toledo's commercial interests understood the equation immediately. They had the gas. They had the sand, clean, fine, silica-rich sand drawn from the shores of Lake Erie, among the best glass-making sand in North America. What they did not have was an industry, or a man who knew how to build one. Edward Drummond Libby was born in 1854 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the son of William Libby, who had built a modest but respected glass-cutting operation in Cambridge. The elder Libby died in 1883, leaving the New England Glass Company to his son, 29 years old, not a craftsman, not a technician, but a salesman, a negotiator, a man who understood that products needed names and names needed prestige. The firm he inherited was in serious difficulty. Fuel costs in the East were rising. The works were aging. In 1886, the American Flint Glass Workers Union struck the Cambridge operation over wages, and the stoppage dragged on long enough to sharpen what had been a slow calculation into an urgent one. Libby needed a new city, a new arrangement, or a new industry. He found all three in the same offer. Toledo's civic leadership sent him a package: a factory site, 50 lots for worker housing, and $100,000 in cash, in incentive, to relocate and build. This was not charity, it was calculation. Toledo had watched grain and lumber and manufactured goods move through its harbor for half a century. It wanted to make something. Libby took the deal. In August 1888, a train arrived in Toledo carrying 250 glass workers from Massachusetts. They brought their tools, their knowledge, and their families. Libby moved the entire operation 700 miles west, from a city that could not afford it to a city that could. The factory went up on the southwestern edge of Toledo, where the gas lines ran cheap and the Lake Erie sand arrived by barge without ceremony. The early years were not easy. Money ran short. The transition from New England, from its particular atmosphere, its trained labor patterns, its established accounts, had costs that no incentive package fully covered. Libby renamed the operation the Libby Glass Company in 1892. Not a continuation, not a transplant, but a new thing with his name on it, staked to a new city. What Libby made was not cheap glass. He made fine-cut glass, the heavy, faceted, light-splitting tableware of what collectors would call the brilliant period, the kind of glass that sat at the center of a dining table and told every guest what kind of household they were in. He understood, with the instinct of the showman rather than the craftsman, that glass was never only glass. It was aspiration. It was the form wealth took when it wanted to be seen through. Toledo had found its product. Libby had found his city. What he had not yet found was the scale, the way to turn a single factory of skilled hands into something that could supply the world. For that, he would need a spectacle, and a man already working on the floor who was thinking about machines. Chapter 3: The Genius and the Fair. The man already working on the floor was Michael J. Owens, and he had been inside the heat of a glass house for nearly 30 years. Owens was born in January 1859 in Mason County, West Virginia, the son of a laborer who could not afford to keep a boy in school past the age of 10. He went to Wheeling instead, to the furnaces, where children carried molten gather on iron rods and learned to read the color of fire the way other children learned letters. By 15, he was a master glassblower. Not a prodigy, not a wonder, but a man formed entirely by repetition and heat, who understood glass at the cellular level of someone who has burned himself on it 1,000 times. He came to Toledo in 1888 when Libby came, one of the 250 workers on that August train, and he was not the kind of man anyone would have placed at the center of a fortune. The contrast between the two men was total. Libby was a financier's son, a showman, a man who moved through the world in good clothes and understood that the appearance of success was itself a form of capital. Owens wore his apron like armor. He was blunt in the way that men are blunt when they have spent their lives correcting mistakes with their hands. Not rude, not unkind, but stripped of the decorative pleasantries that had nothing to do with the task in front of him. Libby looked at the glass business and saw a theater. Owens looked at it and saw a problem. What Libby had was vision and money. What Owens had was everything else. Libby recognized it. He promoted Owens first to manage the factory floor, then drew him closer into the company's experiments, its failures, its restless attempts to automate what had always been done by hand. The arrangement between them was not a friendship, but a precision fit. Libby supplied the capital and the nerve. Owens supplied the machine. In 1893, Libby put both of them to the test. The world's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago that May. 400 acres of plaster and steel palaces built along the Lake Michigan shore, and Edward Drummond Libby had secured something no other American glass firm possessed: exclusive rights to operate a working factory on the fairgrounds. He had spent money the company could not easily spare. He hired the Toledo architect David L. Stein to design a pavilion on the Midway Plaisance, capable of holding 2,000 spectators at a time. Inside, he installed a 10-pot furnace. He put Michael Owens in charge of it. What Owens ran was not a demonstration. It was a factory at full production, operating in front of paying crowds, 7 days a week, for 6 months. The furnace threw its light across the faces of the watchers. The gaffers gathered and blew and sheared, and the glass moved through its transformations: liquid, viscous, solid, in full view of people who had never stood within 50 feet of the process that made every vessel in their kitchens. They came for the spectacle. They came because Libby gave them something to come for. They came because the century was ending, and no one yet knew what was being built to replace it. More than 2 million people passed through the Libby Pavilion before the exposition closed in October. The company sold an estimated 20 boxcars of souvenir glass. But the thing that stopped the crowd, that drew the Spanish Infanta, Princess Eulalia, to the booth, that was reported in every newspaper that covered the fair, was spun glass. Workers drew molten glass into threads as fine as silk, and those threads were woven into fabric, and that fabric was tailored into a dress worn by the stage actress Georgia Caven. It was not a metaphor, not a trick, not a stunt. It was glass. It moved. Libby left Chicago a national name. The profits from the fair steadied the company. Some portion of what was earned there would, in time, find its way into a museum. He had wagered on spectacle, and the spectacle had paid. Owens returned to Toledo with something the crowds had not seen, a mind that had watched 2 million people file past hand labor and had begun to calculate exactly how long hand labor had left. Chapter 4. 4 bottles, a second. He had come away from Chicago with a number in his head. The number was not a vision, it was a calculation. Every bottle made in the United States in 1893 had been made the same way bottles had been made in ancient Rome: a man with a pipe, a gather of molten glass, and a pair of lungs. A skilled blower could produce 8 bottles in an hour. A factory of 60 men working in punishing heat, with boys darting between them carrying molds and gathering irons, could produce perhaps 4,000 bottles in a shift. It was not fast enough. It had never been fast enough. The boys who worked those factories were not incidental. They were structural. A glass house ran on child labor the way a locomotive ran on coal, not as a preference, but as a load-bearing fact. Boys as young as 10 tended the gathers, reheated the half-formed pieces, carried the finished ware across floors that glowed with waste heat, and worked 14-hour shifts for wages that an adult would have refused. The reformers had been arguing about them for decades. The legislation had been slow, partial, and difficult to enforce. The industry needed the boys, and the industry said so plainly. Michael Owens spent the years after the fair in rooms that smelled of iron filings and burnt sand. Libby financed the experiments. The principle Owens worked toward was not mechanical blowing, but mechanical suction. A rotating iron arm that would dip into a pot of molten glass, pull a measured gather upward by vacuum, transfer it to a mold, and blow it to shape, all without a human hand touching the glass at any point in the process. The machine failed, was rebuilt, failed differently, and was rebuilt again. Engineers, and among them William Bach and others, worked the tolerances on the valve systems and the timing of the mold closures. The Owens Bottle Machine Company was organized in 1903 to hold the patents before the patents existed. On August 2, 1904, the automatic bottle machine was patented. It produced 4 bottles per second, not 4 per minute, not 4 per blower, 4 per second, continuous, uninterrupted, without fatigue, without wages, without childhood. By 1905, more than 90% of all bottles made in the United States were machine-made. A task that had required a master glassblower, 2 or 3 assistants, and a crew of boys was now performed by a rotating iron apparatus that had no lungs and kept no hours. What the machine accomplished for the children of the glass houses was not mercy. It was not reform. It was not the culmination of anything the settlement workers or the labor commissioners had fought to achieve. Not out of conscience, but out of obsolescence. The children were not freed. They were made unnecessary. The distinction matters. Though the outcome for a 10-year-old boy in 1906 was largely the same. He was no longer wanted in the factory. The reformers took the credit. The credit belonged to iron. The scale the machine unlocked was something else. Glass had been a craft. It became a commodity. The Owens Bottle Company grew on licensing fees as the machine spread across the industry and across the world. Not a manufacturer of bottles so much as a landlord of the method by which all bottles were made. Owens became wealthy in the way that inventors sometimes do and usually do not. The company grew. The licenses compounded. Meanwhile, the Trenton gas field, that reckless stroke of geological luck that had drawn Libby north and brought the industry with him, was largely spent by the early 1900s, burned off at volumes the drillers had never bothered to calculate against the supply. The cheap fuel that had made Toledo possible was gone, or nearly gone. It did not matter. The men, the machines, the capital, and the patents had taken root in the city, and roots do not follow fuel. The accident of cheap gas had built a permanent thing. The permanent thing was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Empire. The permanent thing began to multiply. In 1898, 4 years before Michael Owens filed his first bottle machine patents, 6 years before the machine ran at 4 bottles a second, Edward Ford had already broken ground on a plate glass works south of Toledo, on a flat bend of the Maumee River. Ford came from glass money. His father, John Baptiste Ford, had founded the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company in 1883 and built it into the dominant flat glass operation in the country. The son was not content to inherit. He incorporated the Edward Ford Plate Glass Company and raised a company town on the site, naming it Rossford. His own surname fused with that of the Ross family, his wife's people, as though he intended the place to outlast him. Plate glass production at Rossford commenced in 1899. The glass was large, flat, polished to a surface that reflected without distortion. The glass of department store windows, of bank lobbies, and soon enough of the automobile. The automobile changed everything Toledo was already doing. In 1916, Edward Drummond Libby and Michael Owens formed the Libby-Owens Sheet Glass Company to produce continuous flat glass by the Colburn process, a drawn sheet method that pulled molten glass in an unbroken ribbon from the furnace. The product became windows. It became windshields. It became the transparent membrane between the driver and the road, manufactured in volume that Pittsburgh's hand-drawn methods could never have matched. Toledo was not merely supplying glass to the automobile industry, it was supplying the automobile industry's eyes. The mergers came in sequence. In 1929, the Ostekris Balsans Inaiminda, the Owens Bottle Company merged with the Illinois Glass Company to form Owens, Illinois, the largest glass container manufacturer in the world. The jars on the pantry shelf, the bottles in the icebox, the tumblers handed to children at dinner in 1 million American kitchens. In 1930, the Libby Owens Sheet Glass Company merged with Edward Ford's Plate Glass Company to form Libby Owens Ford, 3 founders' surnames compressed into a single corporate name, and LOF became the principal supplier of safety glass and windshields to the Detroit automobile industry, the glass in the windows of moving America. In 1938, Owens, Illinois, and Corning Glass Works combined patents to create Owens Corning Fiberglass, headquartered in Toledo, commercializing a material that had not previously existed at industrial scale, glass spun into fibers, fibers pressed and woven into insulation, into hulls, into structural composites. Toledo had invented not just a new product, but a new category of material. The men who built it did not live to see all of it. Michael Owens died on December 27, 1923, at 62 in Toledo, not wealthy in the manner the machine's revenue might suggest. He had never stopped spending on the next invention. Edward Drummond Libby died on January 13, 1925, at 71, in the city he had chosen over Cambridge, 37 years before. The firms continued: Owens, Illinois, Libby Owens Ford, Owens Corning. The names survived the men who bore them, absorbed into corporations that had no memory of the New England glass blower, or the Ohio gas boom, or the afternoon in 1888 when a train arrived, with furnaces in its freight cars. The founders became letterhead. By 1938, the meaning of Toledo was no longer local and no longer narrow. It was not a city that made glass objects. It was not even a city that made glass. It was the administrative capital of the glass age itself, the headquarters from which the bottles and windows and windshields and insulation of modern American life were designed, licensed, manufactured, and distributed across a country that used them without thinking about where they came from. A single mid-sized city on a river in northwestern Ohio had built the containers that held American food, the panes that enclosed American rooms, the glass that American drivers looked through at the road ahead, The city it had built was worth seeing. Chapter 6. The Glass City. The city it had built was worth seeing. Edward Drummond Libby had understood that before almost anyone else did. In 1901, while the bottle machine was still years from its patent, Libby and his wife Florence founded the Toledo Museum of Art. Not as a vanity, not as a monument to themselves, but as a conversion of industrial wealth into something that could not be loaded onto a rail car and moved to New Jersey. The building that rose on Grove Place was Greek Revival marble, spare and confident, the kind of structure that announces permanence, the way a courthouse does. On his death in 1925, Libby left the bulk of his fortune as an endowment. It still funds the museum a century later. The glass barons had built factories and pipelines and corporate headquarters. Libby had also built a collection: European old masters, ancient glass, American painting, that would eventually rank among the finest in the country. The wealth had been converted. That part, at least, could not be undone. Toledo was making other things now. In 1941, the Willys Overland plant on Stickney Avenue began building the Jeep, a squat four-wheel drive vehicle designed for the United States Army and tested in the mud of the nearby fairgrounds. Soldiers drove it across North Africa, across Normandy, across the Pacific Islands whose names most Americans had never heard before 1942. Toledo had given the world the bottle, the windshield, the fiberglass hull, and now the vehicle that carried a generation through the largest war in human history. The city did not dwell on this. It simply made the next one. Picture Madison Avenue on a weekday morning in 1955. The headquarters towers of Owens, Illinois and Libby Owens Ford rise against a sky that is, in certain seasons, the color of the lake. The Jeep plant is running 2 shifts across town. On Summit Street, the department stores, LaSalle's, Lion Store, Teek's, are open, their windows dressed, their floors crowded with women who drove in from the suburbs spreading west and south since the war ended. The Maumee, a few blocks east, carries ore boats and grain carriers past the grain elevators that have stood there since the 1880s. On its hill to the west, the Marble Museum holds its Rembrandts and its Roman glass, in rooms that are cool even in August. The freighters move slowly. The glass towers catch the light. The name of the city and the name of its product are, in the minds of purchasing agents in 43 states, the same word. In the evening, the executives go home to Ottawa Hills and Maumee and Sylvania. The line workers go home to the neighborhoods off Cherry Street and Dorr Avenue, the bungalows with the small yards, the parishes whose names are Polish and Hungarian and Slovak. The museum closes. The harbor quiets. 14 miles away, on the other side of the county line, the new subdivisions are still going up. Foundations poured, frames raised, windows waiting to be set. The windows are made here. By 1970, 383,818 people lived in Toledo, the 4th largest city in Ohio, a fact that appeared in the Chamber of Commerce literature without irony. The administrative capital of the Glass Age sat at the center of its own economy. The raw materials came in through the harbor, the finished product left by rail and truck, the profit stayed in the towers downtown, and the endowment on Grove Place and the houses in the western suburbs. The system was self-reinforcing and had been, with minor interruptions, for 80 years. A child growing up in Toledo in 1960 knew what the city made. She could see the towers from her school window. She could name the companies the way a child in Detroit could name the car brands. The glass, like the lake, was simply there. Permanent, foundational, not a fact so much as a condition. It is the kind of certainty a single industry city can afford only for a little while. Chapter 7. The name goes to Britain. The decline did not begin with a closed factory. It did not begin with a layoff notice tacked to a break room door, or a furnace shut down on a Sunday morning, or a parking lot that stopped filling. It began with a press release, filed in the spring of 1986, announcing a transaction. In April of that year, Libby Owens Ford, the company that had stitched three founders' names into a single corporate identity, the company whose laminated glass had separated every American driver from the wind for half a century, sold its entire glass business to the Pilkington Group. Pilkington was a British multinational headquartered in St. Helens, Lancashire, a company that had been making glass in England since 1826. The price was not published in ways that lasted. What was published was the fact, the glass operations, and the name Libby Owens Ford itself now belonged to a company 4,000 miles away. The Toledo entity that remained, the holding company stripped of its original purpose, renamed itself Trinova. It kept Aeroquip, kept Vickers, kept Sterling. It kept the profitable, diversified divisions, the ones that had nothing to do with glass. The name it gave away was the one that had mattered. What had been given away was not merely a trademark. The name Libby Owens Ford carried Edward Drummond Libby, who had arrived in Toledo in 1888 with a failing New England company and rebuilt it on Midwestern gas. It carried Michael Owens, who had stood barefoot in a glass factory at the age of 10 and eventually mechanized the entire industry. It carried Edward Ford, whose family had pressed the first plate glass west of the Alleghenies. Those men had become letterhead decades before, their names formalized into a corporate logo, their decisions absorbed into institutional memory. Now the letterhead itself had emigrated. It was a British brand, operated from Lancashire. The founders had not only died, they had been sold. This was not a failure in the ordinary sense of the word. Libby Owens Ford was not bankrupt in 1986. It was not desperate. The sale followed a logic that had become standard in the decade's corporate grammar. A diversified holding company, the reasoning went, could return more value to shareholders when its divisions were separated, priced, and sold to buyers who specialized in each one. Glass was a capital-intensive, cyclical, low-margin business. The non-glass divisions were not. The solution, in that logic, was obvious. The glass, the original thing, the reason Toledo had a skyline and a museum and a self-image, had become the divisible asset. The company kept what was profitable and sold the heritage. None of this was announced as a diminishment. The transaction was a strategic realignment, a sharpening of focus, a value-creating separation. The plants in Toledo and elsewhere kept running under Pilkington's ownership, the furnaces still burning, the workers still clocking in. No factory closed on the day the papers were signed. The city did not immediately look different. A child born in Toledo in 1986 would not have noticed, could not have noticed, that anything had changed at all. But the ownership had crossed the Atlantic. The decisions about capital investment, about plant modernization, about which facility to expand and which to quietly reduce, those decisions were now made by people who did not live 40 minutes from the Maumee. A city whose entire identity had been built around a company's name had watched that name change passports, and the watching had been nearly silent. It was the first of the departures. It would not be the last. Allen Chapter 8. The largest glassmaker leaves. It was not the last. The year after Libby Owens Ford crossed the Atlantic, the other shoe fell, and it fell on a different scale. In 1987, Owens, Illinois, the direct corporate descendant of Michael Owens's bottle company, the largest glass container manufacturer in the world, was taken private in a leveraged buyout arranged by the Wall Street firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. A leveraged buyout works as follows. The acquiring firm borrows heavily against the assets of the company it is buying, then loads that debt onto the acquired company itself, leaving it to service the loan out of its own revenues. The new owners were not glassmakers. They were financiers. The distinction mattered. The company that had once organized itself around a single Toledo riverfront tower, the Seagate headquarters building, occupied since 1981, its glass curtain wall a quiet advertisement for the product its tenants made, now belonged to men who had never worked a furnace or timed a gob. The transaction did not move the company immediately. For nearly 2 decades, it remained headquartered in downtown Toledo, bearing the name. It had shortened that name by then, shedding the Owens, Illinois formality for the compressed corporate syllable OI, as though the history accumulated around the longer version had grown heavy and inconvenient. That compression was its own kind of signal. In 2006, OI moved its world headquarters out of downtown Toledo to a suburban campus in Perrysburg, in Wood County, across the county line. The largest glassmaker on earth, the company that still carried the commercial inheritance of Michael Owens, of Edward Drummond Libby, of everything Toledo had built across a century, left the city for the suburbs. The hook had always been accurate. This is what that looked like: a corporate campus beyond the county line, a riverfront tower slowly draining of purpose, and a city that had organized its identity around glass headquarters, discovering, in the plainest administrative terms, that the headquarters had chosen to organize itself around something else. The pattern was now legible. First, the name had crossed the ocean, LOF, to Pilkington, to Britain. Now the headquarters crossed the county line. OI did not vanish. It still existed, still manufactured glass in facilities around the world, still registered revenues that would have seemed extraordinary to the men who built the original factory on Ash Street. But the relationship had inverted. The city no longer held the company. The company merely operated near the city, on terms of its own choosing, at a remove it had selected for itself. Meanwhile, the population fell. It had peaked at 383,818 in 1970. The 1980 census recorded 354,635. The 1990 census recorded 332,943. The 2000 census recorded 313,619. The 2010 census recorded 287,208. Each decade a subtraction, each count a smaller number than the last, the line descending with the steadiness of something structural rather than accidental. Downtown lost residents not in a single catastrophic event, but through accumulation, through the quiet arithmetic of people who left and were not replaced, of children who had watched their parents work in glass and understood without being told that the trade was not waiting for them. The towers still bore the names for a while. The glass curtain walls still reflected the momie. The floors behind those windows emptied floor by floor, year by year, until the buildings became monuments to a period rather than evidence of an ongoing enterprise. A city built around headquarters became, in the course of a single generation, a city the headquarters had left, the largest by corporate departure, the others by slower and, in some cases, more violent means. The departures were not finished. Chapter 9. The Liability. The departure of Owens, Illinois to Perrysburg in 2006 did not finish the story. The company that remained, Owens Corning, born in 1938 to spin glass into fiber and sell it as insulation, was already deep in a different kind of reckoning by then. It had been in federal bankruptcy court since October 2000. The proximate cause was not fiberglass. It was asbestos. The distinction matters, and it is precise. Owens Corning had built its reputation on spun glass fiber, the material the company was created to commercialize, the product Toledo had woven into its industrial identity. But beginning in the early 1950s, Owens Corning also manufactured and sold a separate product, Kalo, a high-temperature pipe and boiler insulation designed for industrial applications, power plants, shipyards, construction sites. Kalo contained asbestos. It was not the glass that damaged people. It was the asbestos the company had mixed into its insulation and sold alongside the glass, in the same era, from the same industrial complex. The material the city was proud of, and the material that would nearly destroy its maker sat, as it were, on the same shelf. The workers who installed Kalo were pipe fitters, boiler makers, and shipyard laborers, men who cut and handled the insulation in poorly ventilated spaces and breathed the fibers their work set loose. Asbestosis and mesothelioma are slow diseases. They incubate for decades. The lawsuits did not begin arriving in force until years after Kalo had been pulled from the market in the early 1970s, when the connection between asbestos exposure and disease had become too well documented to contest. By 2000, Owens Corning had been named in roughly 243,000 asbestos personal injury lawsuits. The company could not pay them. On October 5, 2000, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It would spend 6 years in reorganization. It emerged in 2006, but only after agreeing to fund an asbestos victims' compensation trust of more than $5 billion. The trust was the condition of survival. The company that had commercialized a safer-seeming insulation, founded in part on the premise that spun glass was a cleaner material than what came before, had nearly been dissolved by the asbestos it had folded into its other products. Not the glass, but the asbestos. Not the innovation, but the additive. The last act of the departure sequence fell on the first company, Libby Glass. The original firm, the one Edward Drummond Libby had carried west from New England on the 1888 train, the one that had built the Toledo Museum and populated the world's tables with pressed tumblers and stemware, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in June 2020. The proximate cause was the COVID-19 pandemic, which had shuttered the bars, restaurants, and hotels that constituted the majority of Libby's commercial market. The hospitality industry stopped buying glassware because the hospitality industry had stopped operating. Libby emerged from bankruptcy in November 2020, reorganized as a smaller private company, its debts restructured, its ambitions correspondingly reduced. The founding firm survived. What it survived into was not what it had been. 4 companies had built Toledo's industrial identity. One had been sold to British interests, one had moved its headquarters to a suburb and shed its original name. One had been bankrupted by the asbestos in its own insulation. One had been bankrupted by a respiratory virus that closed the restaurants. They did not leave in the same way, at the same moment, or for the same reasons. They simply left, sold, relocated, reorganized, reduced, and the city that had named itself after one of its products was left holding that name and the debts it implied. What remained after 2020 was a city of roughly 270,000 people, a depleted tax base, aging infrastructure, and a water system that had already, 6 years earlier, demonstrated exactly how fragile the remaining machinery of municipal life had become. Chapter 10. What Remains? On the morning of August 2, 2014, Toledo woke to a recorded phone message. The city's water system had detected microcystin, a liver toxin produced by a cyanobacterial bloom spreading across the western basin of Lake Erie. At dangerous concentrations in the municipal supply, do not drink the water. Do not cook with it. Do not boil it. Boiling concentrates the poison. Nearly 400,000 people in Toledo and its surrounding suburbs reached for bottled water they did not have. The Ohio National Guard set up distribution points in parking lots across the city, handing out pallets of plastic bottles to lines of people who had, until that morning, assumed the tap was the least complicated thing in their lives. The warning lasted 3 days. It was the same Lake Erie that had supplied the harbor, moved the sand, fed the shipping lanes, and drawn the glassmakers north from the Pennsylvania coal fields in 1888. The same lake that Edward Drummond Libby had looked out at when he decided Toledo was the place to build something permanent. The same western basin whose shallow, warm margins had made it ideal for industrial water intake. And ideal, it turned out, for the phosphorus and nitrogen runoff that had been draining off surrounding farmland and suburban lawns for decades, slowly loading the water with the chemistry that, in the right summer heat, blooms into something a city cannot drink. The lake that made the glass city had spent 126 years giving the city everything it needed. Then, for 72 hours, it gave the city something else. The corporate exits were already complete by the time the water turned. LOF was British. Owens Corning had settled 243,000 asbestos claims and emerged from bankruptcy reorganized. Its headquarters still in Toledo. Its connection to the city now administrative rather than foundational. OI had relocated its offices to Perrysburg, 11 miles south, close enough to count, far enough to signal something. Libby had filed for bankruptcy in 2020, sold its assets, and re-emerged under new ownership as a licensing entity carrying an old name. The Jeep plant on Toledo's north side still ran shifts. Glass was still made in facilities scattered across the metro, but the industry no longer organized the city the way it once had. Not the streets, not the tax base, not the self-image of a downtown that had built itself around the assumption that the companies would stay. The population in the 2020 census was 270,871. At the 1970 peak, it had been 383,818. Toledo still printed Glass City on its welcome signs, still put the name on its minor league hockey team, still carried the designation the way a place carries a name that outlasted the thing that earned it, not as description, as inheritance. What the glass left behind, the museum kept. The Toledo Museum of Art stands on Grove Place, still governed by the endowment Edward Drummond Libby put in place in 1901, still one of the significant collections in the country. In 2006, the museum opened the Glass Pavilion, a structure of curved, transparent walls enclosing the museum's glass collection, a building that is itself made almost entirely of the material it was built to display. It sits on the edge of the museum grounds catching light. It cannot be loaded onto a rail car and moved to a suburb. It cannot be sold to a British conglomerate or liquidated in a bankruptcy proceeding. It was not a factory. It was not a product. It was the one form the glass took that could not be extracted from the city that made it, and it is still there. The Maumee River still moves east through downtown, under the same bridges, past the same industrial waterfront that once supplied the nation's bottles, toward the same lake. The Glass Pavilion catches the afternoon light off its curved walls and holds it for a moment on the hill above the river. The welcome signs say Glass City. The lake is quiet and flat and enormous at the edge of the city, the way it has always been. The same body of water that built Toledo, and on one August weekend, the city could not drink.